When I first got the job, they didn't tell me anything strange about the night shift. No one pulled me aside with a wink and a warning. No old-timer whispered ghost stories by the coffee pot. It was a small town, population 4,000 on a good day, and the most excitement anyone expected was a rowdy football game or a call from Mrs. Turner about her stolen mail again. The most unsettling thing, I figured, would be the silence, the quiet, hollow kind of dark that hangs over towns like ours after midnight. The chief met me on my first night, a tall guy with tired eyes and graying hair. He shook my hand firmly, his grip lingering a second too long. "You read the rules I left on your desk?" he asked. I nodded, but I hadn't. I'd glanced at the paper before stuffing it into my pocket, assuming they were standard shift protocols, reminders to lock up the station or fill out my logs. He didn't need to know that though, and he seemed satisfied enough, giving me a stiff nod before sending me out on patrol. Only then, sitting in the cruiser under the dim light in the station lot, did I take out the paper again. In plain, blocky handwriting, 6 rules stared back at me. Rule 1, stay in your car between midnight and 3:33 a.m. Don't leave for any reason. Lock the doors. Rule 2, if you see a pair of headlights coming toward you after 2 a.m., turn off your lights, put the car in park, and keep your head down until they pass. Rule 3, if you hear someone tapping on the window, ignore it, even if they call your name. Rule 4, around 3 a.m., you might see someone in the rearview mirror. Do not look directly at them. Keep your focus straight ahead until they're gone. Rule 5, there may be a patrol car that looks like ours, but the numbers will be wrong. Do not acknowledge it, and do not get out of your car if it pulls up beside you. Rule 6, never answer your radio after 3:33 a.m. If you hear any voices, turn it off. Don't turn it back on until sunrise. I frowned. Was this some kind of initiation? Joke. Maybe the chief got a kick out of hazing the new guy. It felt stupid, but there was an uneasiness that sat heavy in my stomach as I reread each rule, trying to rationalize them, trying to find some angle that made sense. When midnight rolled around, I found myself in the parking lot of an old gas station that hadn't been in business for years. I cut the engine, leaned back in the seat, and tried to settle in. The night air outside was dead still. No hum of life or distant traffic, just an almost oppressive silence. For the first half hour, I thumbed through my phone, scrolling through old messages and news stories to pass the time. The rules itched at the back of my mind, each one hovering like an unspoken threat. Midnight to 3:33 a.m. Strange, precise window of time. I kept the doors locked, my hand absently checking the latch as I sat there. There was no good reason to leave the car. Anyway, the last thing I wanted was to stumble around in the dark, hearing nothing but my own footsteps echoing off empty streets. Somewhere after 1 o'clock, a soft fog began to roll in, settling low over the streets. It wasn't thick, just enough to blur the edges of the world outside. I adjusted in my seat, watching as it twisted around the street lamps, coating the already quiet town in an unnatural stillness. I checked my watch, 2:05 a.m. And that's when I saw it, the first test of the night. Headlights, faint at first, glowing like distant fireflies on the opposite end of the street, slowly coming toward me. A perfectly normal sight on any other night. Just a car driving through town. But I remembered the rule. If you see a pair of headlights coming toward you after 2 a.m., turn off your lights, put the car in park, and keep your head down until they pass. Reluctantly, I reached for the light switch, clicking it off. The interior of the car plunged into darkness, the only glow coming from the faint red numbers on the dash. I put the car in park and waited, my head tilted forward, but my eyes sneaking a glance up as the lights got closer. The car was old, the kind you might see in movies from the 70s. It rolled slowly, its headlights cutting through the fog in thin, eerie beams. There was something wrong about it, though, something I couldn't put into words. The way it moved felt off, like it was floating rather than driving, barely disturbing the fog as it crept toward me. As the car neared, I forced myself to look down, squeezing my eyes shut and pressing my forehead against the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed to lift my head. Just a glance, just enough to confirm it was some harmless late-night driver. But I stayed put, feeling a cold, crawling sensation spread over my skin as the car passed, slow and deliberate, its engine purring quietly as it glided by. I waited until I could no longer sense its presence, until the faint hum of its engine faded into the night. When I finally looked up, the street was empty, only the fog drifting lazily where the car had been. My hands were clammy, fingers stiff as I gripped the steering wheel. It was ridiculous. I was a grown man, a cop, sitting here terrified of a rule that was probably designed to haze rookies. But as I sat in the silence, the unease only deepened. Hours stretched by in dead silence. I could feel myself starting to drift, the heavy drowsiness of a long night settling over me. I checked my watch, 3 a.m. on the dot. I rubbed my eyes, fighting to stay alert. I could feel the minutes dragging, every tick of the clock a subtle taunt. My gaze drifted up to the rearview mirror, out of habit more than anything, and that's when I saw it. A shape, faint but unmistakable, hovering in the back seat. At first I thought it was a trick of the fog, maybe some reflection from outside, but the shape didn't move, didn't waver. It was as if someone were sitting right behind me, close enough to reach forward and grab me if they wanted to. Around 3 a.m. You might see someone in the rearview mirror. Do not look directly at them. Keep your focus straight ahead until they're gone. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, my breathing shallow. I wanted to look, to turn around and see who or what was there. But the words of the rule sat like lead in my mind. I forced my eyes to stay on the road ahead, my pulse, a steady thud in my ears as I stared into the foggy emptiness beyond the windshield. The figure didn't move. It stayed there, unmoving, just a dark silhouette that seemed to shift at the edges of my vision. I could feel its presence, solid and wrong, like a weight pressing into the back of my seat. Minutes passed. Finally, slowly, the weight lifted. I didn't dare look in the mirror, not even a glance, until the feeling completely vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence in its place. When I risked a look, the back seat was empty. I took a shaky breath, fingers stiff as I flexed them against the wheel. A sense of dread had burrowed into me, and no amount of logic or self-assurance seemed to shake it. I'd followed the rules. I was still here, but the night wasn't over, and somehow, I knew I'd only scratched the surface. The hours continued to crawl, thick and syrupy, as I sat alone in that car, my mind running through the rules over and over. The silence grew heavier, like something lurking just beyond the edges of hearing, waiting for a crack in my resolve. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing at the rearview mirror or the foggy streets, expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. As the first hints of dawn began to bleed into the night, a small part of me dared to relax. The rules had felt like some fever dream, a trial of my nerves, but the fact remained I'd survived. Whatever haunted this town at night, whatever old, twisted specters or nightmares came out to roam, they'd left me alone. When I finally drove back to the station, the chief was waiting by the door, watching me with those tired eyes, as if he already knew what I'd seen. He didn't ask if I'd followed the rules. He didn't have to. The look he gave me was enough, an unspoken warning, a grim reminder that the night shift here was far from normal. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I clocked out in silence, the chief's eyes on me as I left, feeling the weight of a night that lingered far longer than it should have. After that first night, sleep didn't come easily. I spent hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. The feeling of that shape in my back seat wouldn't leave my mind. nor would the memory of the old car rolling by. On my second night, I arrived at the station, just before midnight, trying not to notice the way the air felt heavier the closer I got. I nodded to the chief as I clocked in. He just nodded back, wordless, and handed me the same paper he had the night before. I still had it, folded in my pocket like a talisman, but I took the new one anyway. Something about his face told me he wouldn't appreciate questions, so I didn't ask. I tucked the paper into my shirt pocket, though the words were burned into my mind well enough by then. It felt like they'd been there forever, and something told me they'd be staying with me for a long time to come. Midnight hit, and I started my shift. The streets were quiet, as they'd been the night before. Too quiet, really. In any other town, you might hear a few distant voices, maybe the dull hum of late-night TVs, from houses with curtains still open. But here, there was nothing. The fog had returned thicker than the night before, coiling around, the street lamps like smoke. It was almost as if the town had been drained of life. I drove the main roads first, checking intersections, passing darkened storefronts and empty parks. The feeling of being watched crept over me more than once, but I ignored it, forcing myself to focus on the routine. A simple patrol, nothing more. An hour passed without incident, then two. I was just beginning to let my guard down when tap came. It was soft at first, a little noise, barely noticeable over the hum of the engine. I thought it was the radio for a second maybe, some weird static or a misfire from the equipment. But then it came again, louder, like a finger tapping against glass. If you hear someone tapping on the window, ignore it, even if they call your name. I froze. The taps were coming in a steady, unnatural rhythm. It moved from the driver's side window to the back, each tap precise and somehow too hollow, too deliberate, like someone outside the car was making sure. I heard every single sound. Then I heard my name. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to leave no doubt. The voice wasn't one I recognized either. Officer Carter. The voice paused, letting my name hang in the air. I gripped the wheel tighter, my eyes fixed on the dashboard, refusing to turn. The fog outside thickened, and the tapping resumed, faster now, as if whoever or whatever was out there was growing impatient. Officer Carter. The voice came again, closer this time, just outside my window. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, my breath shallow and controlled. Part of me wanted to glance sideways, just to confirm it wasn't real, to see nothing and laugh it off as some late-night delusion. But the other part, the one that remembered the rules, wouldn't let me move. The tapping grew louder, angrier, shifting between windows, as though it was circling the car, looking for a way in. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, trying to keep myself anchored, refusing to acknowledge it. I didn't know how long I sat there, my mind a whirlwind of instinct and dread. The tapping wouldn't stop, each knock more violent than the last, until it felt like something was hammering on the glass, desperate to break through. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I could feel something outside, watching me, a presence so heavy it felt like the fog itself had taken on a life of its own. But I didn't move, didn't so much as blink, until the feeling lifted, until the fog began to dissipate. Only then did I dare look around, finding the windows perfectly intact. Not a single mark on the glass. Whatever it was, it had left me for now. I took a deep breath, the air thick and stale in my lungs, as I forced myself to relax. My hands were sore from gripping the wheel, my knuckles pale in the dim light. The night continued on in silence, the minutes dragging into hours as I drove through the empty streets, every instinct on high alert. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself near the edge of town, where the main road cut into the open stretch of forest that bordered the county line. The fog had thinned out, drifting in sparse patches that floated across the road. almost like they were watching me as I passed. I kept my gaze steady, the rules running through my mind like a mantra, and that's when I saw a patrol car, parked just off the road, its lights off, but the shape unmistakable. It was an older model, maybe a few years out of commission, but definitely one of ours. A Ford with the same stripes, same decals, everything in place except for the number on the side. The number was all wrong. I forced myself not to slow down, not to look too closely. I'd almost convinced myself it was just some abandoned car, left by a previous shift when the headlights clicked on. My stomach dropped as the car pulled onto the road behind me. Its lights dim but unmistakably focused on me. I kept my speed steady, my eyes glued to the road ahead, refusing to acknowledge the vehicle creeping closer in my rearview mirror. The urge to speed up, to pull over, to do something clawed at me, but I didn't dare break the rule. It followed me for a good mile, always staying just behind me, its headlights a dull, unnatural glow that seemed to pulse in the darkness. And then, without warning, it sped up, closing the distance until it was right on my bumper. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the wheel, every nerve in my body on edge as the car seemed to push closer, practically nudging me forward. I fought the urge to look in the rearview mirror, to see who or what was behind the wheel. The rule was clear: do not acknowledge it. For a split second, I thought about braking, about forcing it to stop, but some instinct warned against it. There was something deeply wrong about that car, something that went beyond mere imitation. After a long time, the car finally backed off, its headlights dimming as it slowed down, drifting into the fog like it had never been there. The road ahead stretched out in a desolate line, the fog thickening once more as I drove on, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The rest of the shift was a blur, the silence pressing down on me as the hours crept toward dawn. Every now and then, I caught myself glancing at the mirrors, expecting to see those headlights again, or something worse. When the first light of morning finally broke through the mist, I felt an almost physical weight lift from my shoulders. I drove back to the station, each mile feeling like a reprieve, the daylight washing over me like a lifeline. I parked in the lot, taking a moment to collect myself before stepping out of the car. The chief was waiting by the door, his eyes scanning my face with a knowing look. "How was your shift?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew the answer. I didn't respond. Instead, I handed him the folded paper, my fingers still trembling slightly. He nodded, tucking the paper into his pocket without a word. "Get some rest," he said, his voice low. "Tonight's the hardest night of them all." I didn't know what he meant by that, and part of me didn't want to know. As I left the station, the weight of his words settled over me, and I realized just how deeply those rules had rooted themselves in my mind. There was no doubt now, this town had secrets, and whatever was out there in the dark had no intention of letting me leave. On the third night, I arrived at the station with a feeling I hadn't had since joining the Force of Quiet. Simmering dread that hung at the back of my mind like the edge of a storm. The chief was waiting by my car when I pulled in, and his expression was grimmer than usual. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there the night before, his gaze heavy and unblinking. "Last night of the training shift," he said, handing me the paper with the rules again, as if I needed reminding. His hand lingered on the paper as I took it. There was something in his eyes, something close to sympathy. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then he just nodded and stepped back, his silence somehow making everything worse. I settled into the car, checked my radio, and listened to the static hum over the speakers as I glanced at the rules. One last time. Rule 6. Never answer your radio after 3:33 a.m. If you hear any voices, turn it off. Don't turn it back on until sunrise. The other rules had taken their toll, each night grinding away at the last bits of logic and rationality I'd held on to. But that last rule was the one that sent the chill all the way to my bones. I'd been a cop long enough to know that a radio was a lifeline, the only connection we had out there. It was a rule that seemed meant to push me past the point of reason, a test I didn't fully understand. Midnight came quietly. The town was cloaked in the same heavy fog, thicker than it had been the nights before. The first couple of hours passed without incident, but as I sat there in the silence, I felt something heavy in the air. At around 2, headlights flared in the distance. They moved slowly, cutting through the fog as they made their way toward me, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. This time, I didn't wait to test it. I clicked off my lights, put the car in park, and ducked my head low, keeping my eyes on the floor as the lights drifted closer. I could hear the hum of the engine as it passed. The sound wrong, hollow, echoing like it was coming from a different place altogether. When I risked a glance after it was gone, I saw the fog settle again, undisturbed, as if the car had never been there. And then, as the clock ticked toward 3 o'clock, something happened that made me grip the wheel until my knuckles were white. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure man standing just outside the driver's side window. He was too tall, and his head was tilted. Do not acknowledge it, I thought. I could see from the corner of my eye that the thing was waving at me now. Slowly waving, and I don't know how, but I knew it was smiling. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tall figure faded into the mist. Time dragged on, and I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the edge. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes crawl past as I waited for dawn, and then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the radio crackled to life. I jumped, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Static buzzed from the speaker, crackling with faint, indistinct voices that shifted in and out, as though someone was trying to reach me from the other side of a vast distance. I turned to switch the radio off, my hand hovering over the button. But then, through the static, I heard a voice that I hadn't heard in years, one that I knew better than my own. Daniel, please, can you hear me? My blood ran cold. It was my father's voice. He'd died 6 years ago, buried in the small cemetery just outside of town. I'd stood by his grave, watched as the dirt covered his casket, and yet, here he was, speaking to me through the crackling haze of the radio. Please, Daniel, I need your help. I froze, my hand trembling, as I stared at the radio. Every instinct screamed to turn it off, to follow the rule, to leave the past where it belonged. But the voice continued, pleading, filled with a desperation I couldn't ignore. Daniel, you've got to listen to me, please. I'm stuck here. I can't leave. You have to help me, son. You're the only one who can. The words scratched at something raw inside of me, memories of late nights in his study, the smell of his aftershave lingering in the air, his hand heavy on my shoulder as he gave me his old stories of life and loss, of pride in the force. Every piece of logic I had was melting away, replaced by that familiar ache of grief. Dad. The word slipped out before I could stop myself, my voice barely a whisper. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then his voice came back, softer this time, more real. Daniel, I knew you'd hear me. I knew you'd find me. I just need you to come. Come to the place where we used to go. By the river, please, son. The river. We'd spent so many weekends there when I was a kid, fishing off the banks in the early morning light, watching the water as it drifted lazily by. I could almost see it, smell the fresh, dewy grass, feel the rough bark of the old oak tree where we used to sit. But something was wrong. I could feel it. Deep in my bones, a wrongness that didn't belong in my father's voice. The radio crackled again, his voice fading in and out, slipping between familiar tones and something colder, something that shouldn't have been there. Turn it off, I whispered to myself, trying to tear my hand away from the radio, but the voice kept pulling me in, tugging at memories I hadn't visited in years. Please, just come to the river, Daniel. I'm waiting for you. I need you. son. My hand hovered over the dial, my mind spinning, and then I remembered the rule. Never answer your radio after 3:33 a.m. If you hear any voices, turn it off. Don't turn it back on until sunrise. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to turn the knob, cutting the voice off mid-sentence. The silence that followed was deafening, a weight pressing down on me like a physical force. I sat there, breathing hard. The only sound, the faint hum of the engine. The voice had sounded like him. Every inflection, every hesitation, just as I'd remembered. But I knew deep down, I knew that whatever I'd heard on that radio wasn't him. It was something else. Something that knew him. Something that had reached into the depths of my mind and pulled out the one voice that could have broken me. I finished my shift in a haze, barely noticing as the first light crept over the horizon. When I returned to the station, the chief was there, waiting for me by the door. His eyes were dark, hollow, like a man who'd seen one too many things he wished he hadn't. I didn't say a word. He just gave me a slow, understanding nod and placed a hand on my shoulder. When the shift ended, I drove straight to the cemetery. The morning sun cast long shadows across the graves as I walked between the rows, making my way to the simple headstone near the back, marked with my father's name. I crouched down, setting a handful of wildflowers on the grass, the cool morning air chilling my skin. I don't know what I heard last night, I murmured, my voice barely carrying in the quiet. But I know it wasn't you. The wind rustled through the trees, the leaves whispering as they drifted down around me. There was a stillness here, a peaceful silence that I hadn't felt since the beginning of my shift, 3 days ago. Whatever haunted those nights, whatever lived in the dark corners of that town, it hadn't followed me here. I stayed there for a while, listening to the quiet, the memories drifting around me like specters. And as the sun rose higher, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I'd made it through something that was meant to break me. When I finally left, I didn't look back. The rules stayed with me, though, a warning, a reminder that some things in this world exist beyond the edge of reason, and that sometimes, survival depends on following rules we can't understand. I drove back to town, and as I passed the station, I saw the chief standing there, watching me drive by with a look that told me he understood.